Thank you for that introduction, Peter, and it's really my pleasure to give this update on where we're at with the development of the Interim Science Action Agenda on behalf of the science program. So, without delay, the purpose of today's presentation is really just that, to give you, the Council, an update on where we're at in developing the Interim Science Action Agenda. And in doing so, I'd like to cover 3 items. The first, discuss with you the outcomes from a public workshop we held on May the 6th, which Jessica spoke to you about yesterday. Secondly, highlight key recommendations that we received through that workshop that are guiding how we move forward. And thirdly, share with you our next steps and our timeline for completing the Interim Science Action Agenda. But first, just briefly, I want to revisit with you what is the Interim Science Action Agenda and why we're developing it. I think Peter gave a nice introduction of its context within the science plan. But what is the Interim Science Action Agenda? It's a shared agenda of near-term common priority science actions that will be addressed within a 2-year time frame. It will include an identification of those commonalities and those synergies, as well as the gaps in already identified priority science actions, such as research or monitoring or data needs that are needed to address policy or to inform policy and management decisions. Why is this Interim Science Action Agenda important? What are some of its goals? Well, it's a step in achieving the vision of One Delta, One Science that's embodied in the science plan, which is really an open and community of Delta science working together to provide a shared and common body of knowledge. This Interim Science Action Agenda is also important because one of its goals is to be able to facilitate the leveraging of resources and guide science funding decisions. We see this as a common playbook for how we're going to do science in the Delta in an efficient way that can help accelerate learning. So to draft this initial list of priority science actions, we started down a 3-step approach, which is outlined here. Really, step 1, as this is an interim approach, we want to get something done quickly. We wanted to identify the science needs, questions, and actions in existing plans and documents. For example, in the Delta Plan, you list in your policy chapters science and information needs. We looked at those types of needs and actions across multiple plans. Then we wanted to synthesize those across all these efforts that are going on in the Delta, come together with an identification of the commonalities and of the gaps. And then really that this would be used then to inform science work plans in the Delta, and so that we could start working on kind of building this one common body of knowledge across the science community. And because this Interim Science Action Agenda is a community agenda, we sought early input on what we were doing. So we'd really taken a couple of steps, some initial steps to complete steps 1 and 2. We held this workshop on May the 6th. We had about 40 participants that represented broad interests. We had federal, state, local agencies present. We had members of the NGO community, as well as private consultants and the interested public. The participants were engaged in discussion where we really asked feedback on what we had done so far, which was look across about 26 plans and documents, pulling out those science needs and actions, and trying to find commonalities. There was a lot of challenge in doing that, so we asked participants to give us their input on what was missing in what we looked at, how could we improve what we've done so that it could provide a more useful tool for them to collaborate and coordinate their science efforts. And we were able to receive some really useful input. I think you have a summary of that input that we received through some workshop evaluations as part of the attachment 2 of this item. Thanks to our Sea Grant fellow, Mei-Ling Rodham, who put that together, where we were able to ask participants about their knowledge of the Interim Science Action Agenda, both before and after the workshop. We were pleased to see that people's knowledge about this effort increased. I think it brings transparency and relevance to the effort. We also asked participants about their opinions on how important they felt that the Interim Science Action Agenda achieved some of the expected goals and intended uses. And we asked some questions about if this would be a useful tool for them to coordinate their science efforts, leverage resources, coordinate proposal solicitation packages to address common research needs, and be used to provide input into their individual programs' annual science work plans. We were pleased to see that the responses from the participants, we got about a 50% return on evaluations, which we felt pretty good about, where they saw the Interim Science Action Agenda as something positive, that they would like to use this for coordinating efforts. It has important implications for their work moving forward. So in addition to the evaluation responses we received, we got some very thoughtful and constructive feedback just through our workshop discussions that are really driving how we move forward to develop a useful Interim Science Action Agenda. And so I'd like to highlight 3 categories that those recommendations really fell into. The first being feedback on what was missing in our preliminary synthesis. We heard from the workshop participants that we really needed a better organizing framework for these science actions. Specifically, we could use conceptual models to highlight where our uncertainties are now and how these actions will help reduce our uncertainties moving forward. We heard that we could use topics in the State of Bay Delta Science 2008, for example, aquatic ecosystems or levee system integrity, and use that as a way to organize what actions we're going to take in the near term to improve our knowledge and understanding of the system moving forward. We also heard that a number of the priority science actions that we looked at were coming from these documents that in some instances were outdated. We could go through and ask a number of programs, what are your top priority science actions, and they wouldn't necessarily be in something that was already published and on the shelf. Secondly, we heard examples of priority science actions. What are the types of things that might go into this interim science actions? What are those examples of actions that would be useful to address? And so we heard that as examples to develop landscape scale conceptual models and tools to prioritize geographic areas for restoration. This might sound familiar to you. We are encouraged that this was consistent with what is identified by you, the council, in your Delta plan. We heard that priority science action should include tools and mechanisms to support science synthesis, create transparent processes for evaluating data. These also might sound familiar to you as these are embodied in the science plan, so we're encouraged that the community felt these were important things moving forward. And as Peter mentioned yesterday, we're moving forward with a data summit next week to start taking action on some of these things. Other examples included obtaining population estimates for Delta smelt. This is a science action that right now we're relying on abundance of indices, and so this was one thing the science community thought could be useful. And the last one on this list here is to initiate joint proposal solicitation packages. When we looked across different plans, we saw the majority of the actions listed were research or study items. So we are encouraged that the idea of a shared approach to answering these questions was something that would be useful. Thirdly, we heard, in the community recommendations, we heard strategies for moving forward. And these strategies, as I mentioned before, really encompassed building on the other recommendations. There are a lot of priority actions out there that we could be taking. We heard suggestions to look at all of the reasonable and prudent alternative actions in the biological opinions, voluminous numbers of documents that really, to be efficient, the group strongly felt that we should move forward in gathering this key information through focused interviews, and so we're moving forward on that. We also heard the importance of building on existing collaborative efforts. Some of the examples that came up that we're following up on are building on efforts such as the California Water Quality Monitoring Council, their efforts with their web portals, the estuary portal, related to synthesis efforts. The Interagency Ecological Program has put effort into their management, analysis, and synthesis team efforts to try to build on existing efforts towards more addressing that need for mechanisms for focused synthesis. And the Delta Restoration Network has started down a path for developing a framework for how we develop these landscape scale visions for restoration, landscape scale conceptual models. And so we're looking into how the Interim Science Action Agenda can build on those efforts, not start from scratch, but enhance and help move some of those commonly identified priorities forward. So just to outline how we're taking these recommendations and moving forward, this is a timeline of our next steps. Through this next month, we would like to conduct the interviews to streamline the gathering of this information and identify and summarize these shared science needs and actions. In July, we'd like to take that information, develop this initial draft of the Interim Science Action Agenda. In August, we target to have another public workshop to get input on what we've done and get the Delta Independent Science Board to weigh in on this list of priority science actions. In September, complete the Interim Science Action Agenda. That is our goal. And in November, present the Interim Science Action Agenda to agency leaders at the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. So that concludes my update, but I'd like to ask Peter if he has anything he would like to add before I take your questions.
Lindsay, I think that was a very good summary, and this, of course, is just a suggested way forward, so we look forward to your thoughts on the process as well. Is there anything missing?
This is very encouraging, Leslie. Good report. I